Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Little Lunch Lecture for Friday, November 13th, which I didn't realize was Friday the 13th until I woke up this morning. My name is Stephanie Barrett. I'm the Director of Donor Relations for the Coastal Land Trust. I think we may have some first timers with us this morning, so just wanted to give everybody a reminder that we are recording and we're on Facebook Live. Hi, Facebook land. Hope people are watching out there. There will be some links in the chat throughout the talk if you want to click and then later on go sign up on our e-news list to stay in touch with us. That'd be great. Chip in a little donation every once in a while to help continue to support the Little Lunch Lectures and other Coastal Land Trust programs. We wouldn't mind at all. And last reminder is we'll keep everyone on mute during the talk, and then at the end there'll be time for questions and answers, and you can feel free to take your microphone off mute and ask a question, or you can type into the chat and we will we'll ask your question that way. Before I introduce our speaker today, I do want to acknowledge the partnership with the Cedar Hill West Bank Heritage Foundation and the Historic Wilmington Foundation. The Coastal Land Trust is very honored to work with these groups on the Reaves Chapel project. On that note, please join us in welcoming back Joel Cook, who served as our Gulagichi project coordinator in summers of 2019 and 2020. Joel is now the education coordinator at Old Salem Museum and Gardens in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Joel has an extensive background in educational programming. A historian and archaeologist, Joel has developed African American programming for Cowpens National Battlefield and has been an interpreter for several other historic sites across the country. Joel is currently completing his master's degree in maritime studies at ECU while working full-time, so full plate, and he still found time to volunteer to come back and talk with us today about the Reaves Chapel project that he worked on with us. So welcome back, Joel, and we're looking forward to your talk today. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen and then turn off my Microsoft Teams notifications from work. All right, so Stephanie, can you hear me right now? Cool. All right, so first of all, thank you everyone for coming to listen to my talk. I feel special, and it's really nice to see the numbers in there. And this is something that I'm really excited to talk about. As Stephanie mentioned before, I joined the Coastal Land Trust for the Reaves Chapel project back in 2019, which seems like, gosh, a really long time ago now. But back in 2019, it popped up on my radar as a potential internship for the summer. So I was able to come down to Wilmington and spent 3 months there. In 2019, we did a lot of good work. And then in 2020, I wasn't able to come there because of COVID-19, but we still did a ton of great work with getting a lot of paperwork and a lot of things registered as far as the chapel goes. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the history of the chapel and the history of the people associated with it. And then we will talk about the project itself and how that turned out. So first of all, Reaves Chapel is a former AME church, which means African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was located in Nebraska, North Carolina. As of right now, it's thought to be the oldest standing African-American structure in southeastern North Carolina, and it's one of the 2 oldest African-American churches still standing in North Carolina, along with St. Philip's Moravian Church, which I'm now responsible for, which is, I think that's pretty cool. It's one of the few standing structures in North Carolina that's directly connected to the Gulagichi people as well. So the Gulagichi people arrived in North Carolina as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. It uprooted millions of people between approximately 1514 and 1866. It started initially with the Spanish and the Portuguese. We're all familiar with Christopher Columbus. And Christopher Columbus's voyages were the initiation of that because the Spanish basically believed after a while, they started out initially enslaving Native Americans who were here, but they had some messed up perceptions about Native American people where they believed that they were either not strong enough to continue to do the work that they needed done on plantations and in mines and etc. They also believed that because of their skin tone that they were closer to being able to be converted and be more like Spanish or Portuguese people. So from that process, there were some documents that came out from Bartolome de las Casas, who was a priest who visited the New World and saw what was happening with the Spanish conquistadors. And he argued basically that we should not be treating these people like this. We should be converting these people, and therefore we should find another people to subjugate and bring to the New World that are probably more hardy and capable of dealing with this. So the people that they settled on were African American or were Africans. So you had approximately 12.5 million to 15 million Africans who were kidnapped and shipped to the Americas, and approximately 2 million to 4 million died during the Middle Passage. I think that those numbers are a little low, to be honest, especially when it comes to the numbers that died during the passage, because the passage was brutal. It was just absolutely brutal. I've done a ton of research on the passage itself. I've read primary source documents from it, and like the process that people went through, you know, in the passage was just absolutely traumatic, as well as the traffickers who were doing this, because I tend to refer to them as traffickers, and that's become the new language around the Middle Passage because it was human trafficking. But the traffickers who were associated with it didn't always want to report how cruel it was. So like a lot of things that happened during the course of that passage from Africa to the New World weren't documented. But of that 12.5 to 15 million who survived, you had about 388,000 who were shipped to what would become the United States. So at the time it was the British colonies, but it became the United States. A typical slaving vessel during that time period would have looked something like what you're seeing in the picture here. It would have carried between 200 and 400 victims along with the 30 crew members. Male captives were typically chained together in pairs, while the women and children were given more mobility. And that sounds kind of like something where it's just because they're perceived as being less threatening, but in reality, it was that the male captives were considered the most likely to revolt. So they were typically kept chained up, you know, somewhere between 20 and 22 hours a day. They would have rotations where they would be able to come on decks for exercise, and they were forced to go exercise. But for the most part, they were kept chained because they were perceived as dangerous, whereas the women and children were not kept chained up, not because necessarily they were considered less dangerous, but they were perceived as someone that the sailors could have more access to, if that translates well for everyone. It was not, you know, it was not a positive thing that was happening when it came to them being left with more mobility. It was definitely a negative connotation to that. However, because of that, you still had women and children who were participating actively in revolts that happened along the process during the Middle Passage. So there's still research being done on that. One of my favorite sources for that is a book called If We Must Die by Eric Maria Taylor. And he documents every instance of a revolt that happened somewhere along the Middle Passage, whether it's on the coast of Africa, whether it's in the middle of the ocean, or whether it happens once they arrive closer to the Americas. And there's been a significant amount of proof that demonstrates that this was not, you know, a passive thing for people who participated in it. There was never a point in which they gave up during the passage. And the passage can last between 3 weeks to several months. And as it went on in the early years of the passage in the 1500s and 1600s, it could take several months. Later on, it became a more efficient process, and it shortened up to about 3 to 4 weeks. But still along that process, conditions were really rough. You had, you know, hundreds of people kept below decks with no air, in conditions where people are dying every day. There's all types of fluids that are moving around. People don't have an opportunity to go to the bathroom anywhere. Like it's really, really bad. There's a lot of illness moving along. People can't communicate with each other because you have so many different African languages that are being mixed together on board these ships. So it's like, it's Pan-Africanism that's happening on board these ships, but it's not a pleasant process. It also made it difficult to retain, you know, your cultural identifiers as individual African nations because you have to work together in order to survive. So you have to find a way, which is more than likely speaking the language of your enslaver, so that you can communicate with each other and survive. And once you arrive in the New World, or once you arrive in the Americas, the plantations discourage you from working with your, or speaking your language and retaining your culture, because it's considered either something that's very anti-Christian, or it's considered something that could result in revolts. And what you do often see is that those who tend to retain their cultural customs are more likely to want to revolt. So it's the idea of breaking this out of people so that they don't pose a threat to the people who are enslaving them. So the Gulagichi people, which are the people that are responsible for the construction of Reaves Chapel, were they were people that were brought from the western rice-growing regions of Western Africa, which includes Senegal, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, what is now Liberia, at the time it was not, Gold Coast, Togo, what was then Dahomey, Nigeria, and Angola. They were known for growing a specific type of rice, which is not the rice that we know about on the coastal regions of North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. That was known as like Carolina Gold, and it was a different species, but it was grown the same way. But in the process of them becoming the Gulagichi people, you ended up having languages. You know, I mentioned languages when we talked about the ships, and you had languages from, I mean, countless speakers. So you had the Wolof, the Malinka, the Mandinka, Bambara, Fula, Mende, Bai, Twi, Fante, Ka, Iwe, Fan, Yoruba, Bini, Hausa, Igbo, Ibibo, Efik, Congo, Mbundu, and Kimbundu speakers, among others, who were brought to these rice growing plantations. And they were brought to these plantations that were typically more isolated than others because they were further out in less desirable conditions. So if you were someone who was gentried, if you had money, you didn't want to be out on the Sea Islands. It wasn't a pleasant place to be. So you saw a lot more frequently, like if you think about the significant plantations in Charleston, like Drayton Hall. Drayton Hall was about 90% enslaved people, and they pretty much ran that plantation because the gentry people that could have lived there, that owned those places, didn't want to be there, either because of disease or just because of the heat, because of the humidity. It wasn't somewhere that they wanted to be. And there was the perception that African people could deal with those conditions better than the average person could. There was the perception that they could survive malaria and the diseases, malaria, yellow fever, all the diseases that were in those areas better than the average European could. So they were often left, you know, with some overseers, some people who were responsible for taking care of them. But for the most part, they were left to their own devices, which is what allowed the Gulagichi to retain so much cultural tradition and to retain so much of their African heritage. As a result of that, you have the Gulagichi creating what becomes the first and the only African Creole language that survives in the United States. So it was a combination of different words from their European enslavers and then American English coming together to create that with all of those different languages that we mentioned before. So as of right now, you still have the Gulagichi Nation, which is led by Queen Quet. And they're very active. They're doing very, very well. And they work right now with like land retention and making sure that their cultural history is retained. And then there's still a pretty significant presence in cities like Charleston, in Savannah, and then pretty soon in Wilmington, we're going to have our you know, Gulagichi culture revived. And it never really left, but it's something that we're trying to get into the public eye. So the Gulagichi in the Wilmington area were typically on plantations that were being cultivated, rice cultivation that was happening along the banks of the Cape Fear River. So if you look to the left side of this map, the Northwest Cape Fear, you have several plantations listed, one of which you can kind of see there's a bend in the river right by the label that says Cape Fear River on the northwest bank. And that is the basic area where the Cedar Hill plantation was, which is where the people who constructed Reaves Chapel were from. But there are several plantations all along the northwest Cape Fear River and the northeast side. And then when you're moving down to where it converges into the larger Cape Fear River, moving towards Wilmington, there's still a huge number of plantations, and they're all pretty much producing rice, which was called Carolina Gold in this specific region. So the Reaves Chapel was constructed as, it would have more than likely been called Cedar Hill Church. And it was constructed sometime between the 1850s and the 1870s based on the oral history record. It was initially constructed on the bluff, so you can see that we talked about the little bend in the river. And this is a little bit close. It's a different map, but it's closer, so you can see that bend a little bit better. So in the top right corner of this red square is about where we think Reaves Chapel was. We are still working on mapping that. The Coastal Land Trust is still working on mapping that process. I still feel very much a part of that process, but they're still working on getting a more accurate map of that. And we have done some site maps and things, but it's a process. But the initial church, or the initial location of the church, was on that bluff overlooking the river. According to the oral histories, and then there's the oral history, and then there's the written record. And the written record says that Reaves Chapel was moved because of flooding and the danger posed from the weather conditions of hurricanes affecting the river level and potentially flooding it. However, when you talk to Gullah people who have spoken to their elders and kept that history ongoing since that time period, the general consensus is that it was moved because a white landowner, wanted it moved. And that's generally what you hear from the population, is that they didn't really want to move, but it was moved because someone said either you're going to move it or it's going to go. Which, if you look at the time period, 1911, that kind of adds up, because that was a time period in which North Carolina especially, and Wilmington in particular, was dealing with quite a bit of racial turmoil. So you had the Wilmington insurrection of 1898, during which white supremacists took over the government. They overthrew the government of Wilmington, which was more progressive, and stayed in power for quite some time. And even in 1911, you would have been still seeing the residuals of that, because Wilmington and North Carolina more broadly was essentially being taken over by white supremacists. So the idea that they were being forced to move because of white supremacy makes a little bit more sense than a church that's on a bluff with a lot of height, being threatened by river water. That, it's just, you have to, when you work with oral histories, you have to kind of parcel out what makes it, what doesn't make sense. And that kind of adds up what the people generally say about it. So the parcel of land that it now stands on was owned by a formerly enslaved man named Edward Reaves. And because of that, they named the church in his honor, which is how it has the name Reaves Chapel now. So the Reaves Chapel Restoration Project, the picture on the left is the first time that I ever saw Reaves Chapel. So it's a picture that I took when I arrived there I think it was March 3rd of 2019. I came down for a visit from Greenville, and the community came together to volunteer and help clean up and pull vines and plant growth away from the church and help it look a little bit better. But this was the initial process. So the Reaves Chapel Restoration Project, this is what it looked like on the exterior before we started. And then on the interior, you can see the image to the right. There were still Bibles inside. The pulpit was still set up as it would have been when the church closed up in about 2006, because the older members of the church were not able to maintain it, and they ended up having to close it to services after that. So the first steps that we took were, for me, I did the research in the oral history collection, along with Cedar Hill West Bank Heritage Foundation in the town of Navassa. So the town of Navassa, which is under the direction of Mayor Euless Willis. Mayor Willis had already written a book about the history of the people of Navassa, and he mentioned the Gulagichi heritage quite a bit. So I started out with some initial meetings with the Cedar Hill West Bank Heritage Foundation, during which we talked about, what the direction was, and we basically made sure that the Cedar Hill West Bank Heritage Foundation was in the lead on this project because it was their project and they approached the Coastal Land Trust about this project first. So the goal was to make sure that we were always, deferential to the Cedar Hill West Bank Heritage Foundation. But the research I did was basically walking through the process and understanding how we could confirm this church as a Methodist church and how we could confirm that it was involved with the Methodists during the period that it was very active. So the research took me through all types of documents related to the Methodist Church and what their strategies were for constructing churches and how we should go about reconstructing this if we were able to get to that process. And what we found, or what I found, was that it was able to be confirmed that this church was built based on the typical standard of a Methodist church during that time period. There was a template for Methodist churches that came out. It was like a Sears catalog, basically, with different floor plans where you could order a specific church. This community wouldn't have had the money to be able to do that because they're considering that they're formerly enslaved people. They wouldn't have had the money to be able to just order a church and have it made. But they would be able to look at a document like this and understand essentially what their church was supposed to look like. And when you measure this church, the average church size for a Methodist church back then was about 50 feet by 30 feet. And when you measure the square footage of Reaves Chapel, it matches up to that 50 by 30 feet, just about. And then you go and look at other white churches that were in the Wilmington area, down in the southern part of southeastern North Carolina, because I was able to drive around and visit a couple of those different churches. They all measure up in their 50 by 30, and they're all from that same era. So it demonstrates that the people of this church were very aware of the Methodist culture, and they were transitioning into that culture as well. The next step for us was to have a town hall with the Navassa community. So that happened in about June of 2019, and we sat down with the community in the Navassa Community Center and basically talked through what our ideas were for the church. I made the argument that the church should be constructed, or should be reconstructed, based on the 1911 vision of what it might have looked like, because that put it on the cusp of the generation that's still living. Would have been children, would have been grandchildren of the people who would move the church, as well as the people who would move the church being the children and grandchildren of the people who initially constructed it. So that was the conversation that we had, and that was the vision that we agreed on. It came down to us, basically, the town hall ended up running about 2 to 3 hours, and we just had, great conversation the entire time. But we realized we were able to walk through what the church would have seen at that time period. We were able to walk through the idea that it may have witnessed, the emancipation of enslaved people in Wilmington. It would have definitely witnessed the occupation before Reconstruction, the occupation of Union troops of the South as they were reestablishing federal rule in North Carolina post-Civil War. The church would have witnessed, their oral histories of church members witnessing the Wilmington insurrection of 1898. And there are histories of them hiding out in the graveyards around Reaves Chapel because they couldn't be seen out in the streets because they would be killed in the streets. So the church was witness to those things. It was witness to the First and Second World Wars. It's a time capsule. And we wanted to emphasize that as we continue to move forward with the plans. And once we established that with the community, the next steps were the removal of materials from inside the church and then the stabilization of the church for hurricane season. So the picture to the left that you see here is the pre-stabilization of the church. It was taken at about, well, there's still the dumpster there. So it was taken as we were starting to clear out the church. And you can see that the steeple on the left side of the church, as well as the bell that's inside that steeple, we're starting to pull that corner down a little bit. So in order to protect the church and prevent it from collapsing on that side, we removed the steeple and removed the bell through the Balding Brothers, which helped us. Balding Brothers is a company that helped us with the stabilization, and they're continuing to work with us today on that. But we were able to stabilize that section of the church where it was starting to lean. And we took out the stained glass windows, which we think they're not original, but they're very historic. and we were able to take those out and preserve those as well. The stabilization that you see on the left side here where the boards are in place, there was more added to that where there are additional beams that were put into place to protect it. And you can also see in the right picture that the steeple was placed behind the church because the steeple was in relatively solid condition. And we think that it was potentially an additional add-on because when we tried to remove it, it was not nailed to the church. There was just the flashing, and that was it. And that was what was holding it up there, the flashing and then the weight of the bell. So we think that potentially that was an additional thing, especially based on the fact that the bell itself was dated to about 1873. And you can see the bell in this image. So the bell was removed, and we had, a really special moment where some members of the church who could remember when the bell was active, when the bell was ringing, were able to ring it one more time before we put it into storage. And that was a really deeply impactful moment, and there were not many dry eyes around whenever that happened. So the bell was placed inside the storage unit that you see there in the right picture. The steeple, as of right now, still stands where it sits in this image as well. The bell, we worked with the Cape Fear Museum to organize what the process would be for preserving it and restoring the bell as well. And we're still communicating with them on a pretty regular basis about that. We were given some documents, and then we were able to trace the bell back, and we determined that the bell was created at a foundry in Ohio, and it was actually constructed for a schoolhouse. So some way or another, this bell made it from Ohio all the way down to southeastern North Carolina through communications with someone. And I think it's possible too, considering the number of abolitionists that came out of Ohio and the number of generally progressive people that came out of Ohio, that might have been a connection there. But that's just my personal theories and not actual factual material. For the right side of the church, you can see on the left picture here, there's a chimney that's in place. And we ended up having to remove that chimney because you can kind of see through the picture that there was a lot of rot behind it. And when you stepped inside the church, there was just, that entire section was gone because of rainwater getting trapped behind the chimney. So that was removed. And then you can see in the right picture here that we were able to stabilize it. We took posts, or the Balding brothers took posts. I did not take posts because I am not capable of that. But the Balding brothers took posts and drove them into the ground and then stabilized it so that the church wouldn't lean that way towards the break. And that break will eventually be restored once the process of the reconstruction of the church begins. On the interior, we were able to put up some boarding there to protect it from rainwater coming in through that hole. And then the back half of the church here, where you can see the little choir stand, which we think was added in about the 1940s. That choir stand, we were able to remove. We had like a really old historic piano that was in there, which I am guessing is from the early 1900s, and we were able to remove that and store that as well through the back door. The interior pre and post stabilization. So the left picture is, again, the interior picture of the church, and you can see that there were pews there that were donated from another church in Navassa. But all of these materials that were inside had to be removed before the church could be restored, the church could be stabilized. So what I did was I was responsible for the documentation of all of these materials, and we basically created a makeshift archival system in which we documented the date and the time that these things were stored, and then where they were located inside the storage unit. So we took literally every single piece out of there, every single thing that was inside there was documented, and we came up with, I believe it was up in the 170s pieces of individual artifact that were inside this church. And that ranged from the pews themselves all the way over to little letters from recruiting people who were trying to get the church to participate in so there were like Methodist, basically group meetings, and they were sending letters and saying, hey, we're from, the North Carolina Methodists, so African Methodist Episcopal Association, we would like you to come to our meeting, or we would like your pastor to represent. And those were dated all the way up into the 70s. And we even found notebooks from the secretaries who actually were like the grandmothers of people that we worked with on this project, where they had their handwritten notes that they were able to see from whenever they were children, and their grandmothers were documenting stuff inside the church when it was very active. On the right side, you can see it as we were able to deconstruct it. So the floors that you see there are not original, but they are very, very old as well. We believe that the shiplap that you see on the walls there, the white boarding is original. The light fixtures that you see on the top left is not original either, but it's very, very old, sometime in the 1920s or between the 1920s and 40s. And then the choir stand that we talked about in the previous slide is also visible here. So there was a stage that was constructed, where you can see in the left picture, there's like the little, I guess, fencing or border that goes around the pulpit. On the right side, when you remove that, there was a stage underneath where the pulpit was based, and we removed that as well. And then the choir stand, we believe, was constructed sometime in the 1940s, because that was when the congregation that we know about today, that was when the initial pastorship from that time period took over the church and started making modifications to the church to bring it into the modern day. In the summer of 2020, which was this past summer, which seems very, very long ago, there was a planned archaeological survey of the historic Cedar Hill Cemetery. So I was able to work with the State Historic Preservation Office, which I was able to collaborate with a number of different agencies within the State Historic Preservation Office, and one of those was focused on the preservation of African American cemeteries. Outside of this is not the cemetery that I'm referring to. This is the cemetery that's located behind the church and has the more recent burials from the church. So Reverend Juanita David, who was the pastor back in the 90s and the early 2000s, she's located in this cemetery. But there's an additional cemetery, which is probably a lot closer to the original location of the church, which has burials that date back to pre-emancipation. So you have people who were enslaved who are buried there. The most recent burials, I believe, took place in the 1960s, but it stopped being used after that time period. So at this point, it's grown up pretty significantly. It has quite a bit of tree cover, brush cover, but the goal was to go back there, clear that cemetery, and then we were talking about potentially ground penetrating radar. We were talking about using cadaver dogs, but the goal was to be able to document all of the burials that were in that cemetery so that we could submit those to the State Historic Preservation Office for documentation, because there's planned development that's going to be happening in the area, and we want to be able to protect those when that development and that construction of residential area happens. Unfortunately, we weren't able to complete that this summer. I got a little bit sick and we weren't able to do it. But we were still able to document the cemetery that you see here in the image. And we were able to document a cemetery across the street that's also associated with the David Davis family, which was the family that basically led the church from the 40s up until its closing in 2006. We were also, most significantly, able to complete a preliminary determination of eligibility for the National Historic Register. That documentation took quite some time. It took most of the summer, honestly, for me to complete. And it was the result of me working with several different entities. So I worked with the Navasa's leadership, the mayoral leadership. I had to work with the Balding brothers to get the scale drawings of Reaves Chapel and what we determined that it looked like. I worked with the Coastal Land Trust to get like the deeds and proof that there was ownership of the church, and just tons of paperwork that came together for us to get Reaves Chapel acknowledged for the register. Because Reaves Chapel was initially brought onto the register. Well, we initially attempted to get it onto the register prior to me arriving at the Coastal Land Trust, but we weren't able to do that because the church hadn't been stabilized and it was considered high risk for a potential collapse, for something to happen to it that would make it not necessarily worth being on the register. So we were able to stabilize it in the previous summer, and then this summer we were able to do that National Historic Register application, and that National Historic Register application was approved. So the church is now on that preliminary determination of eligibility, and from here we'll see what happens. We have brought additional people on staff who will help with that process, and then hopefully we'll be able to get it registered as a historic landmark, because it is. You know, Reaves Chapel is extremely significant. And when you listen to the legacy that it still has today, and then the legacy that it has as a landmark in North Carolina, and then just the legacy that it has as a landmark to the people, Reaves Chapel is a historic landmark at every level of everything that it could possibly be. You know, it's a county landmark, it's a town landmark, it's a city landmark, it's a state landmark, and it's also a national landmark, because there's just not that much documentation of North Carolina Gullah people, and this is a standing example of that. So it's very important that we're able to preserve this and that we are able to do the work that we did on Reaves Chapel. Oh no, it's my last slide. The next steps for what's going to happen. I talked about the process of preserving the church and getting it hopefully on the National Historic Register, which I think will happen just because I'm a very optimistic person. But my encouragement for people who want to know more about Reaves Chapel or who want to see what they can do to help with the Reaves Chapel project is to talk about it. Because I didn't even know Reaves Chapel existed until I found out about this internship. And Reaves Chapel is arguably, I would say it's one of the top 5 most important structures in North Carolina. But I didn't know anything about it. I didn't know that it existed. So I think that it's very important that you talk about it, because there are too many structures associated with African American people in North Carolina, especially that are either rotting away or already gone. I talked about when I first arrived at this project that I have a cemetery that's associated with my family, and the only thing I know about it is the documentation, because it wasn't preserved, it wasn't protected, because it wasn't considered important. So all I can do is drive past a farmer's field and look out into the farmer's field and know that my ancestors are out there somewhere underneath a tobacco field, which doesn't really help me, you know, and it doesn't really help my ancestors, and it doesn't really honor my ancestors. So Reaves Chapel is an opportunity for us to do that for a community that's still here while they're still here. So I encourage people to talk about it all the time and like let people know that you sat down for this conversation today. You know, talk to one other person about it and then let them talk to someone about it, and share the recorded video, you know, so that they can share it with someone else. Share this on social media and share information about Reaves Chapel. You can go on Google right now and Google Reaves Chapel, Navassa, and everything about Reaves Chapel that we've done in the past couple of years will pop up. And if you're interested in it, you can share those articles online to help us protect this structure. And lastly, you can donate to the Reaves Chapel Restoration Fund, shameless plug. Donate to that fund and help us with the project that we're doing on this site. Reaves Chapel is a very important project, but it's also a very expensive project. It's going to take a lot to get it back to its glory days and to get it back to where it deserves to be. So if you can donate to it, you know, every little bit counts, because if you're spending $1 donating to the site, if 100 people donate $1, that's $100. That's great. You know, if 100 people donate $10, that's $1,000. Or I don't know, I can't do math. It's something. It's math. It's a lot of money, but that's great. You know, and it's really significant. It really helps this project out. And it's also important to consider that this project doesn't have a ton of time, because we've got this site yearly being affected by hurricanes, yearly. So the pace is that the faster we can move, the better, because we only have so much time to stabilize the structure before we have the potential of actually losing it. So I really emphasize again, talk about it, share it, and donate. And that's unfortunately my last slide. So.
Thank you, Joel. I appreciate the shameless plug, and I shamelessly put the link in the chat, so it's very, very easy to click on. Thank you for sharing about your work with us and the time that you've spent on this very important project, and thank you for giving us some of the historical context, because that's part of the story that I think we don't tell as well. And so I really appreciate you starting this presentation with that. I would like to open up the floor to questions if anybody has anything they'd like to ask about, or just go ahead and unmute your microphone and ask, or put it in the chat if you'd rather type.
This is Camilla, and I just want, thank you for a great presentation, Joel. You're just so wonderful as a colleague and as a presenter, but I also wanted to give a shout out verbally to Susanna Jenkins, who is here from the Orton Foundation, an affiliate of the Moore Charitable Trust, because we wouldn't even be here today had we not gotten a very generous grant from that foundation that allowed us to purchase Reaves Chapel, and they've continued to be very generous in supporting work there. So Susanna, thank you so much.
Thank you for the shout out. We're thrilled to do it. And Joel, thank you for your incredible presentation. This was awesome.
Yeah, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
Indeed, Joel, I thank you for your presentation. It was really great. Working on the Greenway Blueway, celebrating the Gulagichi Heritage Corridor, your Reaves Chapel efforts are centerpiece in every presentation that I give to local communities and to state and federal interests. So just know that you're recognized quite often as a pearl in this important effort. I just had a quick question on funding, and this just keeps on nagging at me. I know that you guys are working real hard with some great folks. The Coastal Land Trust is doing outstanding work, the Orton Foundation to be recognized. But you know, it just strikes me, Michael Jordan is a Gulagichi descendant, and he funds a lot of important issues like this. I don't know Michael personally, but I would stop in and say hello to him if there's someone that you can reach to. I mean, there's a few others as well. Oprah is ambassador for the longleaf pine here in North Carolina, another one that might be a good touchstone. And as many times as I watch This Old House, I know you've got a contractor you're working with, but maybe even see if you could capture the interest, especially in this time period that we're in now, capture the interest of a TV outfit like This Old House or some of the other ones that might come in and actually help bring in additional resources or forces that could help move this important project along.
I like the way you think. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Mr. Willis, for those very creative ideas. That's very cool. If anyone on this call has a connection to Michael Jordan or Oprah, please don't miss the opportunity to let us know.
And everyone, I wanted to give you a little bit of background on Brayton Willis. He is working diligently as Brunswick County NAACP for the Cultural Heritage Greenway, and has been a partner in our conversations with the North Carolina sector of the Gulagichi Cultural Heritage Corridor, which is a part of the National Park System. So we love that he brings all these creative ideas, and this whole area is full of culture that has not been recognized in the past, but those stories and days are changing.
Indeed. Thank you.
I do want to ask a question from the chat. Nick Parker was curious, Joel, what is the biggest need as it relates to the restoration in the next steps phase of that?
So the next step was to bring in an engineer, because the biggest problem that we have is that termites like wood. And this is a structure that is made almost completely of wood. So we did have, you know, a significant issue with termite damage to the foundational beams on the church. So the goal, I believe the next steps, and Jessica, you can step in if I'm wrong.
I might step in, Joel, if you don't mind. We have our engineer sets and drawings, and really, truly, the next step for us is to secure funding so we can start the repair. So we are in the mad fundraising phase. And like Joel said, it is an expensive and urgent project. So that is where we are. It is stabilized, and our really big goal is to get this work underway before next hurricane season, because between the termites and the bad weather that we have here, we are on borrowed time. We're looking at about a $500,000 budget, Nick.
So if anyone knows Michael Jordan, just
make that happen. We have tossed around the name Oprah a couple of times. We have yet to contact her, but
I'm going to tell you, if someone can reach him, this is change, pocket change for him, and I think with his tie to the Gulagichi culture, it would be a natural.
Well, we are totally gonna tag Oprah and Michael Jordan on the reshare of this on Facebook and all of our social media. And all it takes is that one person to reshare and retag, like Joel said, share, share, share. The more the people to share, the more likely it's gonna get in front of the right person.
That's a good point. And I think that, you know, there's 30 people in this chat right now. I think that, you know, if 30 people or 25 people start talking about this site, I'm pretty sure that it'll start popping up on the radar of not bigger people, but, you know, people with a little bit of influence. So the idea that we're all sitting here and we all have the ability to share right now and talk about this site on social media. If you don't have social media, talk to someone who does. That makes a huge difference. So I think it's, even though we're talking about these big significant figures, you know, it starts with us.
You're absolutely right. Thank you, Joel. Do we have any other questions before I do our last announcement?
I really, really like questions. So if you do, you can just ask away.
I'm going to make one comment, and some folks may be aware of this. We're going to be approaching the National Park Service's, their Rivers and Trails program for assistance. And I can tell you, because we've been talking about Reaves Chapel so much, this will probably be one of the entry points for the corridor pathway. And I'm looking forward to the National Park Service coming in and giving additional recognition to your effort. I mean, this is the whole idea, is to celebrate these kinds of efforts that you guys get going here. I know that Euless has got some stuff going on with the Mose Heritage Center. So there's a lot of things going on that need to be celebrated that I'm going to try to fold into the National Park Service application for support. That'll give us additional national recognition on this effort.
Joel, it's been awesome having you back with us. If you want to quit your job and volunteer with us forever, we wouldn't mind, but I know you probably need to just do your thing. But join us anytime again. It's been a joy to have you back. So next week for Little Lunch Lecture, Mr. Alton Perry will be with us. He works at Roanoke Electric, and he will be talking about their project called Sustainable Forestry and Land Retention Project, formerly known as the African American Land Retention Project. And that is, we've had an awesome kind of convergence on theme in the last couple of talks. And so I would encourage all of you to come back next week and hear Perry talk about that. November 27th, we will not be having Little Lunch Lecture because we will be celebrating in our little homes together alone for Thanksgiving. And then, but come back on December 4th, Scott Pullman from the North Carolina Natural Heritage Program will be with us, and he will be talking about the Cape Fear Arch, the organization, as well as the geological
namesake,
really,
right?
Yeah, like it's not really a mystery, but the geological sphere of the Cape Fear Arch, and Jessica will be also jumping in on that talk for to kind of give us where we are now with that, and Scott's going to do the history piece of that. So we've got lots coming up, and watch your email, because on December 11th we will be inviting you, the attendees, to participate with our little lunch lecture to tell stories about the places on the North Carolina coast that you love. And details about how you can do that will be coming through e-news, the weekly e-news that goes out Wednesday, Thursday. So just keep your eyes peeled for that, for details about how you can join in on your moment of fame on the little lunch lecture stage. I know you all want to do that. Okay, so have a great weekend. We'll see you back next week. Great to see everybody. Joel, again, thank you. And we'll see you soon.
Okay.
Bye, guys.
Take care.
Thank you.